so we can get started. It's 4:30. I'm sure people will be coming in as we continue. I'm really excited to be here and have this panel and about the whole entire Democratizing Work Global Forum. It's been, yesterday had amazing panels, today more amazing panels, and I'm excited to attend more for tomorrow. This is an incredible event. And so today we're going to start off with Stephen Attewell, and I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll start off from hearing from each of them. Stephen Attewell is an adjunct assistant professor at the City University of New York, CUNY's School for Labor and Urban Studies. He is the author of the book, People Must Live by Work, Direct Job Creation from FDR to Reagan, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. He also writes about public policy and the intersection between history, politics, and pop culture at Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And then after that, we'll hear from Natan last. He is a writer and researcher, and he most recently advised the UN's International Office for Migration on its climate migration policy. And his recent policy papers, essays, and creative work can be found in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Money on the Left, which is amazing. If you're not familiar with it, definitely check out Money on the Left, and Los Angeles Review of Books. And then last is myself, and I teach at George Washington University in the political science department and work on human rights. So first we'll hear from Stephen Attewell.
Okay, thank you. So let me share my PowerPoint. So the title of this talk is The History of Direct Job Creation in the United States, Implications for the Design and Passage of a Federal Job Guarantee. Why I wrote this book. So I was reading the Coming of the New Deal section on the Civil Works Administration at the same time as the 2004 Democratic primary debates were going on. And there was a lot of talk from the contestants, so to speak, about how to create jobs, grow jobs, build jobs. But when, being the budding policy wonk that I was, I went to their websites and actually looked at what their proposals were. They all boiled down to small pots of money thrown at the economy. And I was looking at the Civil Works Administration and thinking, why don't we talk about this? Why don't we hear about this from the debate stage? So chapter 1 explores the origins of New Deal direct job creation thought. And it basically stems from 3 places. First is a new democratic school of social work emerging from the experimentation of the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Second was a borrowing from an eclectic background in economic thinking, which included purchasing power progressivism, proto-Keynesianism, and economic planning. And finally, Louis Baxter's diagram of the economy. So I should explain. This document was created on behalf of FERA during their participation in the Committee on Economic Security, which designed the Social Security system. And what the national balance sheet shows is the public sector and the private sector existing as a figure 8 in perfect balance. But you'll notice under the assumptions at the bottom, it assumes that universal useful employment based on assured jobs in public service in order to make the flows of capital work out right. Likewise, in the explanation of the chart, Louis Baxter argues that government activities constitute, in effect, an auxiliary industry which might always utilize advantageously the entire current labor surplus. To my mind, this is probably the most radical document ever published with government money. And this economic thinking undergirded the Committee on Economic Security's ultimate argument that employment assurance be part of the plan for economic security, working alongside unemployment insurance and old age insurance. In chapter 2 of my book, I look at the conflict between the Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration over which of them would come to dominate the New Deal's spending program. In its essence, what they were going to war over was which model, contracting out of public works to private countries, to private contractors, or direct job creation, and to see which would employ the most people. Ultimately, the WPA was able to out-hustle the PWA by subdividing contracts into $25,000 chunks, which they're allowed to do via direct job creation, and won the majority of funding under the Relief Act. So the WPA and not the PWA dominated. My most controversial chapter in the book is basically an argument that the New Deal ended the Great Depression prior to U.S. entry in World War II. So here we see the difference between a set of employment statistics generated by Stanley Lebergott in the 1950s and later revisions put together by Michael Darby in the 1970s. As you can see, it makes a big difference because the difference between the two is basically the inclusion of New Deal job creation program workers as employed or not. Stanley Lebergott deliberately excluded them from counting as employed, whereas Michael Darby argued that 3.5 million workers had gone missing and now needed to be included in the ranks of the unemployed. As a result, it makes it look quite different that the New Deal managed to get unemployment below 10% twice and entered the war with a 6% unemployment rate as opposed to a 10% unemployment rate. If we look at the data differently, a clear picture emerges of direct job creation at work. So if you look at direct job creation workers as a percentage of the workforce, you can see that throughout the 1930s, direct job creation workers were anywhere between 4% and almost 8% of the workforce, a huge proportion of the the national workforce, and one in which, if they had been suddenly, all fired, unemployment would have spiked, as in fact it did in 1937. What emerges is a picture of a public sector-led recovery in the 1930s, where you see new jobs created per sector, public and private, and the public winning out all but 1 year. 1934 was sort of the 1 year in which private sector job creation outpaced public sector job creation. So why was there no direct job creation in the 1945 Full Employment Bill and the 1946 Maximum Employment Act? Well, direct job creation was originally part of post-war planning for full employment. However, direct job creation and social Keynesian measures were stripped out of the Full Employment Bill by Senate staffers on the Wagner Committee like Leon Kaiserling, who believed that the program for full employment should be devised by the administrative state and that Keynesian planning made New Deal-style direct job creation no longer necessary. It was believed that basically an administrative planning state would depoliticize the Full Employment Bill. Problem was that this attempt to depoliticize the Full Employment Bill ended up turbocharging a tax and spending attack on the bill by conservatives, while simultaneously sacrificing the public's attachment to full employment in favor of a much weaker attachment to economic planning as a concept. As a result, the Full Employment Bill and the Ultimate Employment Act remain somewhat dead letters in American law. By the 1960s, the institutional continuity of direct job creation was broken by the gap between World War II and the War on Poverty. The Department of Labor did suggest a small number of jobs be created in 1964, but it lacked the capacity to do large-scale direct job creation. Moreover, Keynesian confidence in the tax cut and related budgetary limits on the federal government doomed prospects for significant levels of direct job creation. Policy learning took place over time in both the Labor Department and the Office of Economic Opportunity, and the War on Poverty eventually did come around to direct job creation, but too late to translate into policy action because congressional majorities were lost. In the 1970s, direct job creation was rediscovered through CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Administration, but CETA was not allowed to reach the WPA's scale relative to the level of unemployment and was reliant on state and local governments to function. During the 1970s, Keynesians lost confidence in their own nostrums due to the collapse of the Phillips curve. And as a result, the Carter administration internally divided over the Program for Better Jobs and Income, and then negotiated with Humphrey and Hawkins in bad faith, essentially dooming the Humphrey-Hawkins Act as a vehicle for full employment and the right to a job. So there are four key implications of this historical research for contemporary job guarantee efforts. The first is that structure of organization matters. The second is that scale and scope matter. The third is that delivery of public goods matters more than regulation and planning. And the fourth is that conflict within the center left needs to be managed. So, structure of organization. A job guarantee has to be public, not private. As we saw from the example of the Public Works Administration, contracting out, as well as other public-private methods like subsidies and mandates, stymies the full force of job creation. In other words, the Rokahana model of a job guarantee will not work. Second, a job guarantee should be run through the federal government rather than through state and local governments. As seen throughout the New Deal, the old age assistance, Agricultural Adjustment Act, and so forth, joint federal-state programs create an opening for inequality, whether motivated by racism, a particular model of economic development at the state level, or partisan obstructionism to take root. Not that state and local governments, NGOs, and so forth can't be stakeholders in the process, but they can't be in the driver's seat. And this is something that the Center for Budget Priorities and Policy and the Levy Institute needs to take note of. Scale and scope. Direct job creation has to be sized relative to the national labor market and national unemployment rates in order to have a noticeable impact. The danger here is that the Booker experimental model won't register results similar to what happened with the War on Poverty experiments, where they simply didn't spend enough money to have a noticeable impact on the problem. Moreover, direct job creation has to be big enough to cover a diverse mix of activities if we're to actually provide for an equitable and diverse job guarantee. You need light construction and heavy construction. You need public service employment. You need infrastructure as well as green jobs. And the Green New Deal is an enormous opportunity that has to be grasped by the center left. Third, the delivery of public goods and regulation and planning. If we've learned anything from the experience of the Obama administration, arm's length regulation of markets doesn't provide a direct enough connection between recipient of government benefits and voting behavior to produce enduring political coalitions. If there's anything that we learned from the example of 1945, it's that economic planning is a thin reed as well. When it's working, it's taken for granted. It's 99% invisible. When it's not working, it's vulnerable to attack as ivory tower make-believe. Direct, tangible connections between voters and public policy really matters. Finally, conflict within the center-left needs to be managed. As we've seen in recent years, there are a multiplicity of approaches to the problem of a job guarantee. Already, we can see divisions within the Democratic caucus over spending levels and taxation, between progressives and moderates, between modern monetary theorists and balanced budgeters. Likewise, you can sort of see with the AFL-CIO's mixed feelings about the Green New Deal that relationships have to be managed rather than assumed. Okay, and that is my presentation.
Great, thank you so much. That was fascinating, Stephen. And actually, I already have a number of questions, but we'll all present and we'll do questions at the end. And I see Christina has a great question in the Q&A chat box, and there's another new question that just was posted. So everyone can keep posting questions as we go along, and then we'll open up for discussion at the end. Next up is Natan.
Great, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Stephen, for that amazing introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see? Awesome.
Yes, looks good.
Great. So my presentation is called Good Forms of Collectivity, Decommodified Labor, Maintenance Work, and a Job Guarantee. So I am hoping to do three things. First, briefly recapitulate the familiar history of job guarantee proposals, which Stephen goes really into depth with, or has already. Second, I want to talk about that history as it's been represented and metabolized in pretty disparate realms, including art, feminist thought, rights-based activism, and recent climate advocacy. And third, of course, there's this pressing issue of what those representations make possible and thinkable in this contemporary push for a job guarantee. So starting with some of the relevant history, FDR, of course, in his 1944 State of the Union, presses for an economic Bill of Rights. We cannot be content, goes the speech, if some fraction of our people is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and insecure. At the top of his list of entitlements was, quote, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. This is, of course, a time of unprecedented collective labor displacing a global threat. And Roosevelt reasons that to guarantee a decent job, a dignified job, would not only ensure a peacetime focus on, quote, new goals of human happiness, it would also spell security, so a thriving domestic body and a relatively quiet international horizon. In invoking the Bill of Rights, Roosevelt is developing a lexicon of economic entitlement, bridging that of the founders and this post-war idiom of human rights. So similar language appears in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23, one of which reads, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And this is indeed an idea that has wide-ranging geopolitical purchase, with scholars from Amit Badri to Amartya Sen depicting full employment as the economic fundament of participatory democracy, and talking about it in a legal and moral register as a policy that underwrites, quote, the right to a regular income for a decent living, alongside the duty to contribute to social production. And as we know, and as Stephen laid out for us, 2 decades after the New Deal, proposals for a federal job guarantee are at the heart of the Poor People's Campaign, led by an increasingly radical Martin Luther King Jr. And in 1965, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin's Freedom Budget demands, in the name of poverty eradication and racial equality, full and fair employment for all. Coretta Scott King, who in 1974 co-founds the National Committee for Full Employment / the Full Employment Action Council, offered a more transformative vision of what the job and job guarantee might be, moving our conception of work toward jobs that would serve some human need, spotlighting healthcare, education, arts and cultural workers in the spirit of FDR's new goals of human happiness, privileging those over jobs created with a profit-making motive. Of course, in FDR's day, the profit-making motive co-occurs with and worsens war and economic depression, but today, the twin catastrophes of insecurity are unemployment and environmental decay. Even before the pandemic, joblessness affected millions of Americans, with underemployment touching millions more. And the list of ills joblessness brings about is long, and I won't rehearse it here. I'll just note that Japan, citing telework and job loss and the isolation wrought by COVID-19, so all this make cubicles of our homes, has become the latest country to appoint a minister of loneliness. Right. So in the face of this economic and social misery, macroeconomists still peddle a measure called the natural rate of unemployment that, so the Toy model goes, beats back inflation. And so it's encouraging that a recent chorus of heterodox thinkers, many of whom are here today, are joining us in arguing fears of inflation are consistently overblown, arriving only to pat the invisible hands of elites and muzzle the labor movement. We're also beginning to challenge the premise that joblessness is natural as a phenomenon at all. As Pavlina Cherneva suggests, the same way we might squint at, say, the natural rate of homelessness, so should any right-centered approach denaturalize involuntary unemployment. And if unemployment is unnatural, maybe employment itself can avoid despoiling the natural as well. My research is interested in the deep lineage of scholars, artists, and activists envisioning a care economy, with care construed as stewardship that might secure and help heal the personal, the public, and the environmental at once. Whether it's teaching, tending public parks, or elder care, care work has the benefit that it's often low carbon. And from Scott King to today's proposals, from segments of the eco-socialist left to the abundance preached by modern monetary theory, a key demand is working less, which would say reduce emissions from commuting, without reduction in pay. But beyond its greener ends, grounding economic life in care, that is, changing our orientation toward work more than just tweaking the number of care jobs on offer, might also help unstick our politics from the neoliberal muck that's gridlocked environmentalism for decades. It's no coincidence that Coretta Scott King and the Black working class movement behind her advocated for jobs that, quote, served some human need. The other side of the crisis of unemployment is invisible, unpaid caretaking labor often done by women of color, as the pandemic has only made all too clear. Advocates like Naomi Klein, particularly amid the woes of COVID-19, have pushed a similar concept of repair work, where repair is meant to be both civic, battalions of tree planters, but also intensely inward, the practice of connecting or repairing those many crucial connections that our culture so systematically severs. Repair also has to mean reparation, dissolving false national myths and toppling the false idol of the border wall, and Klein and others spotlight proposals for, among other things, an Indigenous land back program. Okay, so what about the remunerative part of FDR's Bill of Rights? This assumption that the work will take place in shops and farms and mines. There's another forebear for the reparative possibilities of the job guarantee in Silvia Federici's well-known 1975 essay, Wages Against Housework, which became an intellectual lodestar of the Wages for Housework campaign, and a call to arms against the injustice of women forced into roles as unpaid care workers. That essay begins in a now familiar riotous slice of collective prosody. They say it is love. We say it is unwaged work. They call it frigidity. We call it absenteeism. Every miscarriage is a work accident. More smiles, more money. Nothing will be so powerful in destroying the healing virtues of a smile. Neuroses, suicides, desexualization, occupational hazards of the housewife. Federici sought to, quote, refuse that work as expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. Her detractors naturally claimed Wages Against Housework would inevitably fuse Homo economicus with home ec, dragging the capitalist ledger into the home in a way that would further dig women into a cultural rut of cooking, cleaning, and consoling. But this misses Federici's point. She wanted an entanglement of for and against, arguing recognition and compensation of care work were shifts that could augur both its refusal and renovation, which sort of echoes the 5 R's that Dr. Gosh talked about today. So it seems fitting that Federici's essay should open with a kind of choral protest in unattributed verse, which is capacious and transpersonal enough to highlight that dual non-compliance. As Lee-Claire Laberge writes in the Federici-inspired Wages Against Artwork, which is itself a treatment of decommodified labor, quote, wages are needed and wages are not enough. True remuneration alone will go a long way. For the precariat, the federal guarantee is the legal backstop that allows for a foundation in care work to begin with. So just as proposals for a federal job guarantee have to deal in these contradictions, recasting fallen and maldistributed aspects of the care work tradition while highlighting invisible lines of mutual dependency around us, so have artists and writers rethought the labor-leisure dichotomy in view of ongoing climate crisis and austerity. So I return to artists like Jenny Odell and Ben Lerner, who are well-known chroniclers of late capitalism, but whose work nevertheless breaks out of just mere opprobrium and into rosier figures of care and maintenance work. Both writers depict traditional sites of labor struggle, Occupy for Lerner, labor union history for Odell, alongside the many different kinds of volunteer or underpaid work at food co-ops or art galleries, as after-school teachers or sculptors, which a federal job guarantee would underwrite. In Lerner's novel 1004, for instance, the narrator is a writer and autofictional double for Lerner. He tells his agent for his next book, quote, "I'll project myself into several futures simultaneously, a minor tremor in my hand. I'll work my way from irony to sincerity in the sinking city, a would-be Whitman of the vulnerable grid." The narrator is obsessed with how, quote, "bad forms of collectivity are figures of its possibility, a proprioceptive flicker in advance of the communal body. A subway car of strangers swapping tips and predictions before Hurricane Irene illustrates the dissolution of social partition, thus born of emergency, not revolution." Lerner's negative figures of collectivity also appear as negative figures of connectivity. So the down power lines of Lower Manhattan post-Sandy, now invisible, grace the novel's cover, which you can see on the slide, in which the only lit building downtown is the Goldman Sachs complex, thanks to a cache of private generators. Another of the narrator's fixations is care work. He lets an Occupy protester shower in his home, cooks him a warm meal. He ruminates on the biopolitics of immigrant women, strollering white toddlers through Central Park. He tutors, though seemingly unremunerated, an undocumented boy named Roberto, with whom he later co-constructs a picture book on dinosaurs. That prefix co recurs in the novel, the sort of linguistic tick of installing collectivity in as many load-bearing verbs as Lerner can find, as a sort of pun on how new imaginations of the corporate can and have to reclaim collectivity from the corporation, in a way that to me echoes Sanjit Paul's concept of coordinating allocation rights. 1004 is interested in the extent to which the line between work and leisure, if work consists in care, might blur for better and worse. And so a house full of writers, quote, was not subject to quotidian rhythms, but to the strange duration of the literary. And the desire to emulate Whitman is as much about poetry as it is an effort to rethink work. Whitman, the narrator reminds us, is, quote, always loafing, always taking his ease, despite ambitions to write a kind of secular Bible for the Union, textual commons, whose first-person I stands for everyone and is, quote, a marker for democratic personhood. It's not lost on the narrator that Whitman, in addition to loafing and writing poetry, was a nurse in D.C. during the Civil War, and that unconventional constructions of leisure might gather the necessary infrastructure for care. Of course, that work-leisure line is often grayed out for good capitalistic reason, right, to extract more labor from workers. Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, reminds us both of the history of union battles for time autonomy and how 21st century corporations weaponize that foggy line between work and leisure in an attempt to optimize productivity in a way that inverts Lerner's strange duration of the literary. Odell's work as a visual artist helps train our attention on figures of collectivity already present, both negative and positive ones, apocalyptic ones and blithe ones. Her collages and Google Earth cutout art make literal what Jed Purdy calls, quote, the manufactured exoskeleton of human life. The 27 tons of built environment per capita that lock in a dark contradiction are profound interdependence. Upkeep of that dependence can be unclean work, though it's often the best game in town. Odell's office workers on the slide tethered to a bright sun in orb of ambivalence, or her wastewater and coal plants photoshopped onto blank purgatory in satellite landscapes, all use this concept of invisible lines in a demonstration of Lerner's bad forms of collectivity, a negative dependency on carbon-intensive industry co-sponsored by sunny industriousness itself. In How to Do Nothing, Odell connects her work to that of Meryl Laderman Eucalis, another artist famous for confronting reproductive labor and infrastructure. So Euclid had been the artist in residence at the New York Department of Sanitation since 1978, an unsalaried role. In her Manifesto for Maintenance Art 1969, she proposes a show entitled Care, comprised of 3 parts that pursue similar commitments to FDR's domestic and geopolitical securities. Personal, Euclid doing household chores, but in an art museum, thus, quote, flushing them up to consciousness. General, interviews with the public on maintenance and their relationship to it, and the societal relationship between maintenance and freedom. And Earth, various kinds of refuse, polluted air, water from the Hudson, delivered to the exhibition to be rehabilitated or recycled. Euclid's work after the manifesto performed what critics like to call the feminist Duchampian trick of defining her motherhood not just as labor, as Federici might have it, but also labor, as Odell might have it, worth paying attention to. Her most famous piece extended that idea to the organism of the city. In Touch Sanitation performance, Euclid spent 11 months shaking hands with and thanking all 8,500 New York City sanitation workers, shadowing sandmen, as they were called, as they traced route lines through the city, delivering speeches about the value of her work and theirs. Thank you, she told each one, for keeping New York City alive. As Scott Ferguson writes, Euclid has us pay attention to the repressed background of social infrastructure and environmental maintenance. If Whitman's loafing generated the secular Bible of America, then Euclid's handshaking was, according to the New York Times, quote, a kind of secular benediction, politicizing the carelessness of the supposedly broke city, while calling attention to the labor of those who, each morning, cared to repair it. Euclid and Federici might have co-signed one another's views on care work. Euclid writes, maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time. But there is a sense in which the long hours spent on care can not only be reinvested with value, social and economic, but saluted as a Whitmanic collapse of self and society, the poet nurse pumping the city free of toxins. After the revolution, Euclid asks, who's going to take out the garbage? To Euclid, in a sense, the revolution is taking out the garbage under union conditions and a 4-day work week. So we can think of a federal job guarantee as an attempt to make policy of the good forms of ecological collectivity found in Euclid and Odell, to not only adequately pay people to take out the garbage, but to celebrate it and recognize it. Already, Americans do countless hours of unpaid volunteer labor, in tutoring or after-school programs like Lerner's narrator in 1004, in soup kitchens, nursing homes, and hospitals. Whitman was a volunteer nurse. And still, most feminized care work is unpaid or underpaid, and almost always undervalued. If these laborers evoke Euclid's sense of the personal, many also work the earth. America's parks draw on over 300,000 unpaid volunteers, alongside a mere 23,000 paid staff. As the co-authors of A Planet to Win write, much vital ecological care work is simply not being done at all. We don't need to make work, we need to pay for it. Beyond the anthemic 3 Rs, that means paying for remaking, retrofitting buildings, decarbonizing transit, co-constructing millions of no-carbon public housing units, restoration and rewilding, rehabilitating prairie grasslands, for instance. The job guarantee is also necessarily a mechanism of racial justice. Public sector jobs and their protections are critical in combating the discrimination that makes Black and other workers of color last hired, first fired. Job guarantee eligibility can sow protections and formal inroads to decent and dignified employment for the formerly incarcerated. It can build on the example of the original Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed tens of thousands of Indigenous people and supported Indigenous self-rule. The job guarantee is a tool of progressive economics, as we know, as much as a green job corps. When private firms can't rely on a reserve army of the unemployed as implicit threats to their workforce, labor's bargaining power goes up. Job guarantee working conditions set a floor the private sector must outcompete. I want to finish by talking about the new possibilities for labor and work we see braided through not just the art and literature that I mentioned, but also that kindred policy papers and history that Stephen was talking about as well. So in 1004, the narrator and his friend Alex often meet at the Met on weekday afternoons, quote, since Alex was unemployed and I a writer. The life of an author offers spontaneous adherence to the strange durations of the literary, but for Alex, it's state unemployment benefits that bank her midday enrichment. Scott Ferguson writes, if fought for and won, the job guarantee stands to function as not only an economic floor for collective production, but also a sensory floor for worldly experience. We know its prior incarnations did just that, whether it's the New Deal's Federal Arts Project, FAP, which is a component of the WPA, which hired, paid, in some cases, launched the careers of photographers, actors, and painters. The last time the federal government directly employed civilians, as Stephen mentioned, was in the 70s under CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, in which tens of thousands of dancers, painters, writers, and musicians formed mobile troops of poets, ran mural workshops in elementary schools, and put on public concerts. CETA, with its federal funding but municipal execution, became a model for community arts programs. Fittingly, Pavlina Tcherneva argues that a federal job guarantee ought to be designed as a kind of national care act, like CETA, federally funded, locally organized, but not at all like the CARES Act in response to COVID-19, which is more corporate intravenous drip than ecological lifeline, the ultimate in bad forms of collectivity. We know recent polling indicates the job guarantee has only continued to garner popularity. And of course, we have Representative Ayanna Pressley's unveiling of a historic resolution for a federal job guarantee, which cites FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and commits to the unfinished legacy of Coretta Scott King. That document acts as a kind of maximalist sanctuary for care workers and artists, modeled after FAP, for educators and environmentalists, and for the concepts of economic inclusivity. So, for one example, residents, not just citizens, are eligible, as well as economic protection, complementing the right to employment with the workers' Bill of Rights. By setting up SHOP as a permanent program and directing funds from Treasury, it also forces a reckoning with the counterfeit logic of American austerity politics. Yougelis's role in the Department of Sanitation was supposedly unpaid because the city was on the brink of bankruptcy. She was hired just 2 years after New York's fiscal crisis in 1975. The Sandmen she collaborated with were between strikes, protesting local budget cuts. But MMT demonstrates that austerity, even within municipalities unable to easily deficit spend, is always a political act, not merely an economic one, and one a federal job guarantee, depending on its administration, could countervail. In that sense, 1004 is a kind of proto-MMT chronicle, the narrator, quote, working his way from irony to sincerity in the sinking city, just as we work our way from zero-sum deficit alarmism to MMT's abundance, so that we might pay people to lift the city back up, whether through shoreline remediation or public art. Whereas MMT thinks of a budget and the legacy of Rustin, King, and Randolph as a moral document, today's democratic commitment to tomorrow's social provisioning, the plot of 1004 turns on the book advance, tomorrow's prose provisioning today's social world. Here's an excerpt. After my agent's percentage in taxes, I would clear something like $270,000, or 54 IUIs, or around 4 Hummer H2 SUVs, or the first 2 editions on the market of Leaves of Grass, or about 25 years of a Mexican migrant's labor, 7 of Alex's in her current job, or my rent if I had rent control for 11 years, or 3,600 flights of bluefin, assuming the species held. I swallowed, and the majesty and murderous stupidity of it was all about me, coordinated, or so it appeared, by money. That coordinated feature, which can be salutary, money as a social form, has led learner to quote the poet Robert Graves, who said, "There's no money in poetry, but then there's no poetry in money either." A federal job guarantee ought to take care of the first part. As for the second, an MMT reading, or anyone sensitive to the prosody in the excerpt I just read, would disagree. Money, as Nathan Tenkus says, isn't just a representation of how much of one thing it takes to buy another thing, dollars for fertility treatments or editions of Leaves of Grass. It's the expression of our politically molded collective understanding of what's truly valuable. That is, we can choose to value and bankroll majesty, funding by way of budgetary infinity sign, environmental revival on our finite planet, nursing and poetry, repair onto reparation, murals and sanitation, the right to meaningful work, and the striving towards FDR's goals of human happiness, re- and co-constructed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natan, for that urgent and inspiring talk. I see people in the audience. You've put questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much, and feel free to continue to do so. And you can also put comments in the Q&A, and then I'll give some final remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion with all of you. And thank you again for coming out for this. I'm really excited to be here. Today, I'm going to try to tie a little bit in between yesterday's discussions on democratizing. So I'm going to focus on democratizing and then trying to tie that in together with today's discussions on decommodifying and how the two go together. My talk is on what I call the human right to intersectional democracy. It's well established in human rights law that women have a right to half the decision-making power. There's a prohibition of any one racial group dominating decision-making over other races. And the poor and impoverished have a right to equitable power over public decision-making. Yet everywhere, these human rights are violated, from national governments, which we talked about yesterday, to workplace governance, which we're talking about today, to global governance. The human right to intersectional democracy and intersectional democratizing is a right of all marginalized groups to have an equitable share of power. And this is the right that's they have right now, not in some distant future to come, which typically never arrives. To pursue intersectional democracy and a true shift in power, people around the world are increasingly using citizens' assemblies, which I'll discuss today. And you probably heard in some of the panels yesterday, which also brought up citizens' assemblies. However, I really liked Stephen and Natan's emphasis on urgency, a sense of urgency. The window for this shift in power that I'm talking about is closing fast. We have little time and we need to act immediately. Our planet is headed for disaster. The human-made climate crisis is rapidly annihilating entire species, and we are in the middle of a mass extinction. Parts of the planet have already become unlivable for humans, driving mass migration, death, and conflict. On top of the climate crisis, the world faces a state of extreme inequality unknown in all of human history. Approximately 8 men, mainly all white men, have the same wealth as the bottom 3.7 billion people on the planet. I'm sure we've heard these numbers before, and it's hard to even contemplate this kind of inequality. But this distribution repeats itself in every country. In the United States, where I'm located right now, 3 men roughly have the same wealth as the bottom half of the entire country. The bottom 80% of Americans hold just 7% of the wealth. And this is a systemic problem across the globe. These extreme disparities are not simply an economic problem, but on top of that, they kill people daily. Thomas Pogge has called global inequality and poverty, quote, the largest crime against humanity ever committed, the death toll of which exceeds every 3 years that of all of World War II, the concentration camps and all the gulags included. And that's every 3 years, repeating itself every 3 years. And he wrote that before the COVID pandemic. We shouldn't be naive about the extent of the violent lengths those in power go to in order to maintain disproportionate and exploitative power over others. On top of catastrophes of climate change and massive inequality, there's a group of scientists arguing that humanity simultaneously faces yet another existential threat. Stuart Russell, a professor of computer science at Berkeley, who has worked on artificial intelligence for more than 35 years, is leading a campaign of thousands of scientists to ban the use of autonomous weapons. Autonomous weapons already exist. A tiny drone that can fit in the palm of your hand, this big, can seek out and kill an individual based on facial recognition without any human involvement once it's put into motion. There are already examples of autonomous weapons being integrated into policing and security forces that are used by those in power to maintain a system of unprecedented concentration of wealth and an ongoing destruction of the planet. Stuart Russell says, quote, the window to act is closing fast. What does he mean by that? We are rapidly approaching a state where the power of the few will overwhelm even the power of the entire world united together. The problem is that we are using the same structures to fight inequality in systems of violence, in the economy, in the workplace, that gave rise to that very inequality. We're trying to use the same governance systems that have been destroying the planet for generations to save the planet. We're trying to use those same governance systems to gain democratic control over the use of violence over the workplace that have for generations been used to violently prevent democratic control. Audre Lorde's well-known words describe the root problem. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We need new tools. Applying human rights law to electoral governance systems and workplace governance, it becomes painfully clear that these systems are racist, sexist, classist, and ableist systems of power. Drawing on the Women's Rights Treaty, known as CEDAW, the Women's Rights Committee writes that what is required under this international treaty, which is binding law, is, quote, a redistribution of resources and power between men and women, and a real transformation of opportunities, institutions, and systems so that they are no longer grounded in historically determined male paradigms of power and life patterns. The human right to intersectional democracy requires a combination of gender parity, meaning women taking part in decision-making on a 50-50 basis with men, and other equitable gender representation, and a right of all races and ethnicities and all socioeconomic classes to have equitable participation in decision-making power, from the workplace to political governance to global governance. Let's look at the US Senate and see if it meets these human rights law requirements. The Senate is 75% male, violating women's rights to half decision-making power. The Senate is 90% white, while the US is approximately 60% white. This is a violation of the right of all races to equitable representation and power. The median net worth of a US senator is $1.2 million, over 10 times higher than that of the median net worth in the US. This is class discrimination. The median age in the Senate is 66, while in the US as a whole it's 32. The makeup of legislatures globally, not just the US Senate, are systems of discrimination and violate human rights law. But what if women, people of color, the poor, and the young, one day in the far distant future, if the earth is still livable at that point, got equitable representation in the Senate or in legislatures globally? We can look at South Africa to see what would happen in terms of racial equity. In post-apartheid South Africa, Blacks, who comprise 79% of the population, have gained at least nominal power and control of the government. Yet whites in South Africa, who are only 9% of the population, still retain over 73% of the farmland and vastly disproportionate control of the country's wealth. That's the situation in a country where only 9% of the population is white. People of color won't gain equitable power in the United States via elections. Elections lead to leaders who are co-opted by existing power. And concentration of workplace power in white male and other elite hands is even worse than the Senate is. We need a new tool, intersectional democracy. How can intersectional democracy be pursued? As one example of a start to addressing these problems, all around the world, people are increasingly using citizens' assemblies. These are bodies of randomly selected citizens to augment and eventually replace existing patriarchal, racist, classist, ableist systems of government. Citizens' assemblies are comprised of a randomly selected sample of a polity. So you could do this in a workplace, you could do this in a state, you could do this in a country, you could do this in an organization, you could do this, it's being done at the global level, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So you randomly select a sample from the group you're talking about, and they're empowered to hear from experts. So if you're an expert in the audience, don't freak out. There's still a role for you and for other experts. We still have a job, but the power is in citizens' hands, and they hear from experts and and civic society and other interests. And they deliberate, debate policies, and they make policy decisions. Citizens' assemblies have an empirical record of success and are rapidly growing around the world, from use in constitution drafting in Iceland and as a mechanism in Mongolia, to giving citizens power of public policy decision-making in Ireland, Belgium, Madrid, and elsewhere. Ireland's legislature gave the power to amend the constitutional ban on abortion to a citizens' assembly. And through a series of steps, it resulted in an amendment that was adopted by referendum. Another case, Iceland. Iceland followed the United States in deregulating its financial industry, leading to the complete collapse of its economy. This is an ongoing systemic problem that we have. Citizens in Iceland demanded the drafting of a new constitution. One key step in the drafting of this new constitution was the creation of a body of 950 citizens selected at random to come up with and draft recommendations for the new constitution. Now, ultimately, politicians got in the way of this, but the step itself, I say, was a huge success. It's received a lot of attention, but there's been little focus on how the use of random selection achieves 50% women's participation, oftentimes for the first time ever. Additionally, the women participants were not drawn disproportionately from elites, which typically happens when women's participation is increased through existing systems and structures, but instead represented a cross-section of women from all socioeconomic backgrounds. At least with this small step, it was, in a sense, the first constitution drafted or being drafted in human history with 50% women's participation, and intersectional democracy as one step in the process, even if it was ultimately stymied by politicians. A key benefit of citizens' assemblies is that they secure 50% women's participation and equitable representation of marginalized racial and ethnic groups and classes, often for the first time ever. This transfer of power is a legal requirement under human rights law, something that electoral governance fails to achieve, and something that tinkering with workplace governance fails to achieve. A citizens' assembly having power in cities like New York, Baltimore, or Ferguson, Missouri, these are all cities where whites are a minority, would give women half the power and would give people of color majority control for the first time in US history, as well as transferring equitable power to the poor. An example from global governance, just from this week, a global citizens assembly is being run as part of the upcoming UN climate summit. 100 randomly selected people will hear from climate experts and develop policy recommendations. Now, this is still advisory, but it represents a future path to a massive transfer in global power, if we can fight to get this enacted as a binding mechanism. In this global climate summit citizens assembly, which is happening in coming weeks, half of the participants will be women. 60 of the 100 people will be from Asia. 17 will be from Africa. 70 of the 100 participants will make less than $10 a day. This is in stark contrast to global governance systems like the veto power in the UN Security Council. For comparison, the veto power in the UN Security Council is 80% of it is in white majority countries' hands, and all of it is in countries where per capita income is greater than $10 a day. So this is a completely different transformative mechanism for decision making. The key, though, is to get real power to these citizens' assemblies. Now, some brief counter arguments. One typical argument against citizens' assemblies is that people aren't smart enough, educated enough, or skilled enough to handle complex questions of government or to run their own workplaces. I always find it funny when academics make that argument. Like, are they saying that academics aren't smart enough to help run the academy? But in other words, what people are saying is that normal people are incapable of governing themselves. People say it's risky and irresponsible to give such people power. Like some people might say, how can you give such massive decision-making power over the climate to 70% of the participants making less than $10 a day? 70% of the people making less than $10 a day would have this kind of decision-making power. How can you do that? People again say it's risky and irresponsible. However, these arguments mirror the exact same arguments that were made against granting women the right to vote, the poor the right to vote, the people of color the right to vote, and they're the same arguments the colonizers made against decolonization. Empirical evidence from citizens' assemblies that have been conducted demonstrates that citizens at large can hear from experts, deliberate, and come up with policies that are far better for society or their country or their workplace as a whole than elected politicians or technical experts or boards of directors can alone. But my root argument here is not that citizens at large can do a better job. The root argument in decolonization isn't that the colonized people could empirically do a better job governing themselves than the colonizers did. The root argument is that this is a fundamental human right to self-determination, a right to govern yourself, a right for me to govern myself in my own workplace, which I don't have. Or I have the right, but it's not being enforced. The root argument is that anything less than this is an abuse. It's treating people as inferior beings, as subhuman. Everyone has the right to rule and to self-determination. Citizens' assemblies with real power, not just as advisory mechanisms, are urgently needed to head off climate catastrophe, a world controlled by those producing autonomous weapons, and all the other abuses that are happening through authoritarian workplaces. When legislatures violate the human right to a job and fail to enact a job guarantee, we should demand the job guarantee issue be given to a citizens' assembly to decide in a legally binding manner what should be done on this question. Now I'm saying we should pursue both avenues. We should try to get it passed through legislation, but when it's blocked, we should also try to peel it off into a citizens' assembly. Ireland has successfully done that to legalize gay marriage, to legalize abortion. This could be an avenue to try to legalize full job guarantee program and protection of the right to a job. Additionally, citizens' assemblies should be used for implementation of the job guarantee. This can be done at the city and other local levels to transfer power over job guarantee programs to women, people of color, and other marginalized groups. Although I will say I definitely agree with Stevens in his presentation that this should be a direct federal control and implementation. It shouldn't be going through states and then on down. So there should be direct federal control, as Steven discussed, but then these local citizens' assemblies can be involved in implementation, bypassing any kind of state governance in the US example. In conclusion, we need to articulate and claim the right to a job and a right to intersectional democracy. These are not just best practices or ideal policies, but legal rights. They're actually already existing legal rights. Those engaging in exploitative workplace and economic practices that are destroying the planet they don't just call them best policies, but they claim themselves hard, unassailable legal rights. And they protect their massive inequality through a system of legal rights. We need to do the same. A first step in recognizing the right to intersectional democracy and a right to citizens' assemblies with real power and a right to a job and a job guarantee. The first step is recognizing these as a right. The harder task will be mobilizing to achieve it in the face of the violent protection of the status quo. Thank you. Now I look forward to all the great questions and discussion. So I can start off, I think, unless if anyone wants to jump in first, but I can start off with, I saw Christina, I think, posted the first question. and then I can read through the rest. So Christina wrote on the chat tab and on the Q&A. On the chat tab, Christina wrote, "I am confused about the division as Fed chairs have already confirmed there's very little that prevents government from spending." And then she continues in the Q&A tab. Christina writes, "Can you speak to how the federal job guarantee and other progressive, massive programs like such can win amidst the narrative surrounding the debt ceiling? What's your personal strategy?" So Stephen or Natan, if you'd like to respond to Christina.
Stephen, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I would say that, we're already seeing a shifting debate regarding the platinum coin as an example of how, the federal job guarantee is sort of moving forwards, the platinum coin and MMT in general being sort of a necessary precondition. But it's also, look, we're talking about, currently an economic debate over spending trillions of dollars on a care economy. We're already starting to have fights on our home turf, so to speak. So, I can't claim to have much, a brilliant personal strategy involved, but I can see that there are, currently debates going on that I think favor our side in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, personal strategy, right? This is a question of rhetoric. I think the Mint the Coin camp has been very good at showing that if Mint the Coin comes across as so gimmicky, wait till you hear about treasury options, right? So there is a lot of argumentation here that's like the whole thing is far crazier than it needs to be, and there's a sense in which Mint the Coin is actually a simple and usable and perfectly legal way to do something that we all agree needs to be done. The arguments, the like use of the debt ceiling as a weapon is itself pretty new, right? It's Mitch McConnell not too long ago, just a couple of decades ago, being like, this is a tool to stymie the Obama administration's goals. And they took the bait in that political fight, right? So I think pointing out those two things, right, that accounting gimmicks are everywhere, the Treasury can do this, and the arguments that it can't are recent, are sort of what I go to when talking to people. But as Stephen says, there's a lot of ground that's already been won. So I'm actually pretty optimistic.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, in addition to all those, I mean, it's amazing how much progress has been made in the legislative debate, just like in recent months and years. In addition to all those avenues, again, I would argue countries around the world should try to peel off the job guarantee issue if they can't get it through their parliament and give it to a citizens' assembly. I think in a citizens' assembly, so we should continue to try to fight this narrative, nationally and in parliaments. But then in a citizens' assembly, you have a rather unique controlled environment, like they did to discuss hot, like really sensitive issues in Ireland of legalizing same-sex marriage, legalizing abortion. It's a controlled environment. People can actually hear from, MMT experts in the room. I mean, they'll also hear from the hyperinflation, hyperventilators. But I trust that, normal people would hear from everybody and come to the conclusion that we need a job guarantee immediately, and they would adopt one. So that's another possible avenue countries can pursue to get around these counter narratives. There was an anonymous question next. What does the current federal job guarantee bill look like, and what are the objections on how it is written now?
If that question is about the resolution by Representative Presley, then I think it looks like what I've talked about in my presentation, right? It's actually quite robust. We can talk about whether it's missing anything. But to me, the keys are things that kind of within MMT and within progressive economics have been debates for a long time. What do we do about migration, right? Do we offer a job guarantee to citizens or residents? This resolution says residents. I think that is the right move on both moral and economic grounds, but mostly moral grounds. So that's one big thing. It directs funds from the Treasury, right? So it sets up shop as all three of us have talked about as a federally controlled and federally funded project, which I think is the right way to do it. I very much agree with one of the big things Stephen said about scale and scope, right? This is a big in scale and scope proposal, and it should be. I think to maybe jump quickly to one of the other questions in the chat about what not to do, right? I think capitulating to the proposals that say job guarantee but are nowhere near sufficient is something we don't need to do yet as a strategic matter and should not do maybe ever as a rhetorical matter, right? So I think, yeah, I think it's a good resolution, and the political innards of whether it's going to happen in the near future is a subject for another tab, I think. Stephen?
Yeah, I would say, if you go to Representative Presley's website, you can find the text of the resolution, and I would encourage people to do that. I would say the major objection to how it's written now, it's a resolution, it's not a bill. You need the let it be, therefore let it be enacted, as well as the be, whereas, so to speak. So, yeah.
Thanks. And then as Natan mentioned, Pavlina Cherneva asks, David Stein retells of Harry Hopkins' warning during the civil rights, quote, "We should not replay the drama of the past New Deal and should not water down efforts as we demand a job guarantee. What concrete steps can we take to ensure we don't do that?"
I think the main thing is, when looking at the drama of the New Deal, first of all, it shouldn't be organized as an emergency program. It needs to be permanent. It needs to be national, as I've said, not running through the states, because that was often a problem with the New Deal, running through state and local governments. Not losing your nerve, right? The decision to pull back from federal spending in 1937 was a bad one, and badly kneecapped progress right as the New Deal was starting to head into more favorable territory. So those would be the main ones that I would think of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, again, coming back to the scale and scope thing, don't pussyfoot around the fact that this is going to be an enormous program. I think that is a merit, not a demerit. And I think that Peltina's question goes to this question of allies, right? So also back to Stephen's point about the center left and kind of how we make allies and do so in a way that doesn't recapitulate some of the missteps in coalition building of the New Deal. And I think that is an open question. My personal take on it is that, I always think back to the 2016 election and thinking about disaffected voters as opposed to like Obama to Trump voters, right? And thinking about a federal job guarantee is doing really well among people who maybe were progressives or Democrats and didn't see anything on the table for them from a policy perspective in 2016. And so I think reaching out to those disaffected voters as opposed to the sort of putative white working class group is, as far as a political strategy in terms of like making allies, something I'm much more interested in. Then I guess the last thing I'd say is that since we've talked a bunch about the history, I think the forward-looking aspects are actually really important here too. So everything from like Molly Krabappel's artistic rendering of like a job guarantee, like a day in the life of a solar panel installer or a shoreline remediator. or thinking about Kate Aronoff has this great article in The Intercept that talks of sort of writes as though we are there, right? Post job guarantee, post homes guarantee, let's say, and someone's coming from there like Red Vienna inspired social housing, where I think painting that future is a way to check to see if we are dressing up the past and like sci-fi dress, but also is a way to like decide where we want to go and depart from the past. And I think we really do need some of that speculative energy in moments of crisis, but also just for a project as big and crucial as a job guarantee.
Chat box, Panayotis makes a comment to add to lifting up the city, rewilding their yards, whether formerly private or apartment commons, breaking down the associated exclusions and alienations. And the next question is from David. What are the challenges involved in getting the labor movement on board mobilized for a federal job guarantee? What lessons does historical experience give us on this question?
So this is an interesting question. You know, on the one hand, you can say there are a lot of progressive unions. Like I know my own old union, the UAW, is always very much in the forefront of pro-job guarantee measures, and the AFL-CIO formally has been in favor of job guarantees, you know, since the 70s. However, in you know, practical function, you know, the danger is the tail wagging the dog when it comes to the building trades, who are used to the contracted out, you know, public-private model, and who would be afraid of being replaced by non-union labor. This is one of the reasons why, like, having a unionized job guarantee is so important, is that we do have to ensure that the labor movement sees the job guarantee as a win and not a loss in terms of, you know, public-private, you know, this is why getting the support of like AFSCME and SEIU would be really critically important, because you don't want to have a situation in which public sector workers are looking at the job guarantee as like an anti-union replacement.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, I think that's thorough. I think like there are tactical questions here, right? So like how organizations talk about prioritizing between, or hopefully alongside, things like the PRO Act and a job guarantee. Like I think that there are clear ways to talk about those two proposals in tandem, and not as, you know, as complements, not as substitutes, right? And I think, you know, to Stephen's point, a lot of this is about, in this case, looking back at history and thinking not just about what went wrong in the New Deal, but for me in particular, thinking about working class alliances across race, right? So like thinking about when, you know, when union drives were able to kind of beat back the narrative that the boss would hang over everyone's heads of, you know, like a racialized other coming to take your job, right? We've had that same exact issue thinking about migration and job guarantee. So I think getting ahead of those arguments and using history to show whether facile is really important. I also think this is a case of there are going to be awkward conversations about a just transition, right? Like thinking about, you know, again, 2016 and the jobs aren't coming back rhetoric that we saw when it came to mining country. I think it's really important to talk about a job guarantee as a part of a set of social services that move beyond the kind of working conditions we have today, and take seriously the idea that everyone can, as Jonathan has talked about, can and should be a part of economic decision making and decent work, and that if that involves, you know, closing power plants, that it's not just that step. There are going to be also openings of solar panel installation companies, to use the same example. right? That this is a part of a time horizon. It's not just one step.
Yeah, it's also why like emphasizing a jobs first Green New Deal is so important. Is that like we don't want to lead with like shutting down the power plant. What we want to lead with is like the building of the windmills and the installation of solar panels. Emphasizing the fact that there like will be green jobs and that they will be unionized green jobs is like critically important for getting the United Mine Workers and other groups on board.
Yeah.
Thanks. And also, if it's too bad, like we can't hear directly from people in the audience, but if you have thoughts too, and you want to write comments as to like what are the best ways to address these kinds of questions, feel free to put your comments in the chat box, and I can read them out as well. I think I've gone through all the questions we have so far. So now we can turn it to Natan and Stephen for further discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about a couple of things. We've talked about, I think this question that Jonathan brings up, right, like the relationship between an international set of laws and institutions, right, like bringing human rights law to bear on perhaps like the way, like imagining like a CEDAW complaint or a HRC complaint, Human Rights Commission complaint, and thinking about how to use the international tools for a job guarantee is an interesting question. And then, Stephen, I don't know if you want to talk about, I really think this question of the federal versus the state is like on everyone's mind. And so maybe we could talk more about that pros and cons list and what we imagine could go right and could go wrong depending on the different, because the administration of it is going to be very complicated.
Yeah, along those same lines, I'll just add to that Nathan's point to you, Stephen, that also I really like your focus on direct job, going through the history and then the direct job creation versus concerns that contractor interests could try to like co-opt things. So it'd be really interesting to hear more about that as well.
Sure. So I'll talk briefly about the contracting out thing and then talk about the state and local thing. One of the things that I find fascinating is you can still find watchdog groups put together by contractors associations to guard against force account, which is direct job creation. Basically, there are like, the Union of California Contractors, or not union, sorry, the Association of California Contractors, like has a tip line where you can go to report like state and local government, well, mostly local government, trying to do stuff themselves without going through contractors. So it is definitely like a boogeyman in the imagination of private contractors that they're going to be excluded. And that is like a nettle that is going to have to be grasped at some point. In terms of the state and local stuff, I mean, I just think, in some ways there's both a historical and a present day approach to this that we've seen. In the past, it was the Dixiecrat states, choosing to implement the New Deal in a Jim Crow fashion. Then it was, massive resistance to desegregation. Now we can see, hyper partisan polarization in terms of, participation in Obamacare or, federal mask mandates or federal vaccine mandates. The state government is just not a vehicle, as long as, the white South exists as this power block in American politics, you can't rely on state governments to do anything progressive. You're going to have to lead with the federal government. And I think it's just, this requires a certain amount of awkward conversation in the center left about like our love of state and local government. In theory, that like we love this idea of locally administered, community organizing. And it's like sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes it really does have to be, a federal bureaucrat running things, because otherwise, if it's not Park Slope, it can turn into, the Deep South real quick.
Yeah, we saw the same thing with recent refugee crisis, right? Giving states the ability to vote up and down refugee admissions, and it's just this needs to be a federal program. That's the way to welcome the already small number of people we are welcoming and get it up. So,
Panayotis also made the comment, "Thanks for airing my question, which points to undoing exclusionary zoning and land use, which tie into the structural exclusions of the past." Yes. And Natan, you mentioned briefly sort of the human rights machinery. This is something in the US we tend to be like kind of completely unaware of. I'm not optimistic that the human rights machinery is going to make an impact in the US system, like the committees in Geneva or things like that. The US routinely ignores them. But my main point is claiming it as a human right. And for countries elsewhere around the world, they do participate in this human rights machinery, but the human rights machinery somehow has become not fully up to speed on what all can be done in terms of the human rights machinery being aware of modern monetary theory, being aware of how job guarantee programs work and things like that. And so this machinery needs to get on board with this real fast. And in other countries around the world, there are courts that make rulings and cause constitutional changes in countries like in Latin America or elsewhere. And in other countries, I'm more optimistic that these kinds of programs could have a real impact through international courts, bodies, development programs, and things like that, if they got up to speed and implemented this as a human right. So, I mean, so many times I hear even like well-meaning human rights activists repeating the same questions of like, how do we pay for things? Or there is a right to a job, but how can we really like implement this or not? And they're completely unaware that this has been done before in the New Deal era and in other programs around the world that have been tried out. So a big part is getting the people who actually are already on our side to be aware of how they could implement these kinds of programs and actually stop harming things by continuing to work through the same kind of logic of the past.
right. I mean, there's a sense in which, there's this buried New Deal history which hasn't gotten as much international airtime as it needs to. And then there's this like human rights machinery that has been efficacious. Like I think a lot of, U.S. scholars and students of international rights law, you sort of come to it and you're like, wait, the U.S. is not going to pay Nicaragua $18 billion in reparations. Like we just can say no. So you're totally right that there's this like two ships passing in the night, and I think it's important to like, we have good case studies of things working well, both in the U.S. past and the international present, that need to be united.
And there's also, history from other countries. Like, a lot of the Humphrey Hawkins Act was inspired by Swedish beredskapsarbete, the Swedish active labor market program that, from the 30s through the 90s covered half the unemployed in Sweden. So it's not like there aren't international examples of job guarantees at work. It's more that just work has to be done to like get those examples in front of the eyes of people.
I'm most optimistic about is like the youngest generation, people like 16 to like, into their early 20s. Um, they seem to get these kinds of issues like immediately, and there's all kinds of receptivity to, the need for a job guarantee, the need to democratize, decommodify, and decarbonize the planet and the economy and the workplace. And so that's an inspiring part of all this.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an enormous part of all of our tasks, and this was alluded to, sort of a through line in the questions in the Q&A in the chat, was this question of like rhetorical strategy. How do we talk about this? What's our personal strategy? And, aside from like working on campaigns of people that we think can do this, or serving in these bureaucracies and so on, writing about it, like there is this question of how to talk about it. And I think, as Stephen and Jonathan have talked about, from mint the coin to the federal government is not a household, right, to the a Green New Deal or federal job guarantee could be, we have this imaginary that like the world is obviously going to be full of grief and destruction in this era of the planet burning up, and it will be, and it's important to not look away from that. But one thing I've been heartened by is how much job guarantee talk includes like an optimistic vision that the world could be otherwise and better. That, one great thing about working less is that you commute a day less, right? Or that one great thing about looking at the horizon of care work that is volunteered and not paid or underpaid is that paying for it builds up an economy around already existing low carbon work, right? That these things can go hand in hand, and that the sort of sacrifice narrative isn't the only one. So I think, like you're saying, Jonathan, I'm very encouraged by us finally coming to some of these like chestnuts of how the world could be a little bit better going forward, and not sort of wallowing in just like, or tilting at the sort of Clintonite windmills of like, do we need a Cory Booker RCT to pay everyone a decent wage? No, we don't, but this is just the right thing to do, and it'll be better.
Well, we're at the end of our allotted time. Thank you everybody for the great questions, and thank you for, I always learn so much. It's always inspiring when you start to get down, coming to these panels and then hearing from both of you and the audience. It's always re-energizing and inspiring. So thank you everybody.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
My pleasure.